Thank you very much. The committee shall come to order. We're meeting today to consider one bill and the postponed votes on 5 resolutions. All have been properly noticed and circulated electronically along with copies of timely filed amendments, and will be available in committee repository at docs.house.gov. Late amendments are also circulated electronically. Pursuant to committee rules, members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend the remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I and House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote has been ordered. Amendments or motions must be submitted by email from a House-maintained email address. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Today's markup is on H.R. 4690, the Sustaining American Fisheries for the Future Act of 2021, which reauthorizes Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, or MSA, which is our most essential fishery law and our framework for governing fishing in federal waters. The MSA is a testament what we can achieve when we place our trust in science, institutions, and American progress. Not long ago, America's fisheries were at a breaking point. Overfishing was rampant, fish stocks were collapsing, and the coastal communities were struggling to make ends meet. The MSA turned things around, and that's why we reauthorized it in 1996 and 2006 to end overfishing, rebuild overfished stocks, and set science-based annual catch limits. America has been and still is a leader in sustainable fisheries management. However, the MSA hasn't been reauthorized for over a decade and is in need of timely updates to address today's ongoing issues, particularly concerning the ongoing impacts and growing impacts of climate change. We know that fish stocks are shifting and ecosystems are changing due to this climate change. This bill gives fishery managers the tools to address climate change impacts on fisheries. Now, as the ranking member mentioned, we can't talk about MSA without acknowledging Don Young. We often heard from him that the MSA should really be called the Young Stud Act, since he and Congressman Jerry Studs were the original sponsors, and then the other body, as usual, put their name on it. Congressman Young was there for the MSA's inception, and it's fruitful and has been a fruitful steward for many years. And I know he'll be missed here today in this discussion. I also want to welcome to the committee Representative Mary Peltola, who is representing Alaska and the first Native Alaskan to ever be elected to Congress. Welcome to the committee, and thank you very much. Representative Peltola is also a longtime advocate of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and I am grateful for her eagerness to work alongside her new colleagues to advance the reauthorization and for the input that she's had in those discussions. I'm glad that her experience as a witness during our MSA hearing that the ranking member referenced last season didn't scare her away from service in this committee. We're very, very appreciative of that. I'm hopeful that in today's markup, we can all work together to improve and preserve the core conservation and management provisions of the MSA and to continue to protect and advance sustainable fisheries across the nation in these changing times that make this authorization even more urgent. Also look forward to today's discussion. With that, I will now call up the bill. The item for consideration is H.R. 4690, offered by Representative Huffman. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the legislation, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Let me now recognize Chairman of the Subcommittee, Representative Huffman, to speak to the legislation. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva, for holding this markup on Sustaining America's Fisheries for the Future Act, my bill to reauthorize the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. This has been a long time coming. over 3 years of work, an exhaustive public input process, unlike, I think, anything we've seen for any legislation that's come before this committee. Congressman Ed Case has been a critical ally and partner in that effort, and I want to thank him very much for that. Of course, we feel a tremendous absence today because one of the original authors of this legislation, of the Magnuson Act, the late Congressman Don Young, is not with us. I'm glad the ranking member put up the picture behind him. I hope we can leave it up for the whole hearing because I think the legacy of Don Young should continue to guide and inspire us on these issues. Don and I talked extensively about this reauthorization bill. In fact, we were very close to an agreement. We'd made a bunch of compromises with each other and actually had a handshake in our final meeting that we were going to move this bill forward. That was the last conversation, unfortunately, that I had with Don before he passed. But there was a lot, even though Don and I would fight on some issues, there was a lot that we agreed upon, from preparing our fisheries for the disruptions that climate change is bringing to increasing representation for Alaska Natives on the North Pacific Council and other things. Following Don's passing, we paused our work on this bill out of respect, and because, as you will hear a little bit more about today, you really can't talk about Magnuson reauthorization without Alaska at the table. And now we once again do have representation from Alaska. I would like to extend a warm welcome back to this committee for Congresswoman Mary Peltola, who was most recently here as a witness. In fact, a witness at a November hearing where she was invited to testify by both Don Young and myself. Congresswoman Peltola is a champion for fisheries conservation and has joined Congressman Case and me in co-leading this legislation. I could not be more thrilled to have her working with us going forward. Now, I started this effort over 3 years ago because as a coastal California representative, I know how important the Magnuson Act is to fishing communities and fishing-related industries. But conversations around Magnuson reauthorization, like so many things in this place, had bogged down in toxic partisan posturing. MSA had become just another proxy for all of these partisan fights that some people believe we have to always have around here. I wanted to reset the tone, and I wanted to refocus this important conversation on policy and science. I'm a firm believer that good process leads to good policy. And so we embarked on a nationwide listening session, interrupted by the pandemic, but not stopped. We continued to push through. We got extensive written feedback from all over the country. Writing and editing this bill, in fact, has been so transparent and stakeholder-driven that I can't think of another bill that has had such a robust and transparent and inclusive process. So while I appreciate the ranking member putting up the picture of Don Young, I do not appreciate the misrepresentation that this is somehow a partisan process, that it hasn't been transparent and inclusive. That's just laughably false, as anyone who has followed this understands. Also want to thank my colleague from Louisiana, Garrett Graves, who participated in one of the listening sessions that we had in Louisiana. And he knows his stuff on fisheries issues and is somebody that I look to and respect and want to continue working with. So among those who gave us input, we heard from the commercial, recreational, charter, tribal, subsistence fishers, environmentalists, scientists, council members, processors, the offshore wind industry, and others. Their feedback has been essential in shaping this bill to address the pressing needs of our marine ecosystem and coastal communities. And we incorporated also several bipartisan pieces of legislation, including proposals from the late Congressman Young. You know, everywhere we went, we heard that the foundation of Magnuson is sound. It doesn't need to be rewritten. But we also heard that it can be improved and modernized. Making our fisheries ready for climate change is one way in which we need to do that, and this bill does that. Making it better at responding to fishery disasters is another way. Increasing support for fishing communities because these disasters are only going to become more frequent with climate change. Congresswoman Peltola will talk a little more about this, but this bill has language to better reduce bycatch, a wasteful practice that results in a devastating amount of fish being discarded each year. There's a lot more that I want to say about this legislation, including thanking the many staff who have worked on it over the last 3 years, but I see that my time is up, so I will get to that as we move forward through the amendment process, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we consider amendments, anyone else, any member wish to be recognized on the legislation? Mr. Case?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, MSA, of course, has governed our nation's fisheries for nearly 50 years. And this law has generally directed best science and management practices towards American fisheries becoming some of the best run in the world. While the MSA overall has been working well for our country, the MSA's success is not universal, and there is no reason to grow complacent, especially as we face new threats that we didn't really recognize a half a century ago. It is time to update the law to reflect changing circumstances and address areas where it has not worked well as it should. Chair Huffman has focused on many provisions in this bill that will strengthen the MSA and propel it into the next century, and I fully endorse his comments. In these remarks, I'd like to focus on the governance structures for the regional fishery management councils, because fisheries management is only as good as its governance. Since Congress first passed the MSA in '76, we've relied on the 8 regional fishery management councils to develop management strategies appropriate for each region's unique fisheries and challenges. When Chair Huffman and I held our listening tour throughout our nation, we listened to the councils themselves. We heard from commercial, recreational, and subsistence fishers. We spoke to our indigenous communities, scientists, conservationists, governments, and NGOs, and what we heard was mixed. As Chair Huffman has already pointed out, in general, the council model was and is working. And it is very clear that relying on a far-removed, one-size-fits-all centralized management structure to perform the same work would not achieve the successes we've seen from the councils. We saw examples of councils that recovered overfished stocks, listened to the science, worked towards transparency, and made efforts to balance the viewpoints of all stakeholders involved in our fisheries. However, we did find other examples prompting us to ensure that our councils remain effective and have adequate guardrails to build trust in our processes and in the results. Sometimes the council's actions have actually reduced fish stocks. And most alarmingly, we heard that some councils lacked any kind of transparency and that their spending raised serious questions. We also heard broad-based concerns that some councils' membership skews overwhelmingly toward commercial industry and short-sighted efforts to maximize profits at the expense of the sustainability of the fishery over the long term. The Western Pacific Regional Council, or WESPAC, which governs my own Hawaiian and Western Pacific waters, unfortunately is one such council that received mixed marks and serves as an example of what we have to address. State officials, scientists, environmental groups, Native Hawaiians, and even the Department of Commerce Inspector General raised serious concerns about how WESPAC conducts its business. Last year, in fact, the Inspector General's office validated some of these concerns in an extensive report in which auditors found well over $1.2 million of taxpayer money that WESPAC spent improperly and recommended immediate corrective actions. We owe it to the taxpayers to ensure our federal dollars are properly spent on the critical mission of sustaining and conserving our vital marine ecosystems, not on controversial awards and questionable and unsupported spending at the behest of council staff with potential conflicts of interest. This legislation before us today institutes the reforms needed to block questionable actions by our councils, provide enhanced oversight, and rebuild public trust. It revisits the council appointment processes to ensure that council members represent not only the commercial fishing industry, but also recreational fishers, subsistence fishers, scientists, conservationists, our indigenous communities, and in fact, all who legitimately claim and want to make our fisheries better. And finally, today's bill clarifies the role of the councils in influencing state, congressional, and executive action, and institutes other good governance policies to strengthen how our councils are run. I extend a big mahalo or thank you to Chair Huffman for this bill and his support for strengthening regional councils in particular. Overall, this bill is strong, comprehensive, and much needed. It will improve the MSA and set us on the path for the next 50 years of fishery management in what will surely be a half-century of existential threat to our oceans. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Gentlelady from Alaska. Before I recognize you, Representative, let me, your first time in this room, you were a witness, and following on the distinguished career of Don Young. And it's just a little bit of pressure, you know? And I say that from a reference point. This room is named after Morris K. Udall. And the region that I represent in Southern Arizona was essentially his district. And his legacy is well established and recognized. And in Alaska, he had a great joke after the refuge, and he came back, and people were pretty angry up in Alaska with him. And his great joke was when he came back after a second visit, and they asked him, "How's it going out there with the controversy?" He says, "It's getting better. Most are waving with all their fingers," you know? And so having said that, I think I understand your situation on a personal level. And it's not about trying to fill anybody's shoes. I've finally figured it out. It's about, there's a path there, and you just walk that path and things keep going well. And so welcome. We're looking forward to your service, and it's a good committee. We get along fabulously. There's no animosity, and we do everything in a totally bipartisan way in this committee. And with that, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. I do appreciate the comments about Congressman Young and his picture being up. I appreciate Congressman Westerman for his remarks about Congressman Young. Congressman Young was Alaska's representative my entire life. And I had the honor of being a Morris K. Udall Scholar when I was in college, and of course have benefited greatly from the provisions within ANILCA that he ensured that rural people have a preference when resources are in a time of shortage. So I really appreciate your comments about both of the gentlemen, and I will share my prepared comments with you now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Huffman, fellow committee members. I started fishing on the Kuskokwim River in our traditional way when I was 6 years old. I know that sounds far-fetched, but this was just a few years after the landmark Magnuson-Stevens Act became law. Not that I had ever heard of it. As a 6-year-old, I was still learning how to operate the outboard motor and pick fish and navigate the river and read a tide book and those kind of things. My understanding and appreciation for protection of North Pacific fisheries far beyond the river has grown in the subsequent decades, as has my awareness of the importance of the Magnuson-Stevens Act and its goal to preserve all fisheries for future generations. Now, 43 years later, I'm honored to be working with my colleagues on the bill before us today to reauthorize this historic legislation. It's been 16 years since the last full reauthorization. We have learned a lot in that time. We've seen what needs fixing, what can be made better, and how, regardless of our political battles, the climate and the oceans are changing. Nothing is more important to me as a member of Congress than to protect the fisheries and the sea life that are crucial to Alaskan survival. These are not my first remarks on this important issue, as you've noted. I testified almost a year ago before the U.S. House Subcommittee addressing a version introduced by the late Congressman Young, speaking in my then role as the Executive Director of the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission. I do wish Congressman Young were still here, but I listened as he talked with me about the law and his respect for his colleagues, and I will work hard to continue his efforts. Those efforts focused on evolving fisheries and ocean environment and the heightened recognition of subsistence needs of Alaska, especially the cultural and economic damage from declining salmon returns. On the Kuskokwim River, chum salmon are at their lowest level on record. Bristol Bay red king crab and snow crab populations have dropped dramatically. The decades-long trend of declining Chinook salmon stocks are continuing. This year was the first year that silver salmon, coho salmon were restricted on the Kuskokwim River. We were not allowed to harvest any toward the later part of the season. The ocean is changing and our management needs to adapt. When I testified last year, my message was that the climate change poses a real and ongoing threat to our way of life and fisheries in Alaska, and the Magnuson-Stevens Act needs to acknowledge and deal with it. The Bering Sea is warming significantly faster than oceans in temperate zones. The Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. HR 4690 before us today, Sustaining America's Fisheries for the Future Act, would amend the Magnuson-Stevens Act so that it better reflects the world we live in today. This legislation designates 2 seats on the Council for Alaska Natives so that we can always be at the table sharing our knowledge for the benefit of all users, subsistence, sport, and commercial. The bill before us today makes great progress towards limiting the wasteful problem of bycatch, the destructive practice that hurts Alaskans who need the fish for sustenance. Bycatch hurts future generations by damaging what should be a sustainable resource. HR 4690 is a solid start towards solving a complex problem. I'm talking with Alaskans to ensure I understand all the issues and pitfalls, reviewing Congressman Young's tireless efforts to improve the law, still thinking, drafting, and redrafting ideas to discuss with my colleagues as this bill moves through the process. I look forward to all of the good things we can accomplish, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before I recognize the next member to speak, Mr. Whitman, let me indicate that I'm going to ask Mr. Representative Case to assume the chair for part of this meeting, and thank you, and we'll make that transition now, and I will, and Mr. Whitman recognizes as soon as Mr. Case shows here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by pointing out that growing up, I worked as a commercial fisherman and as a recreational fisherman. My son is a commercial fisherman of nearly 20 years. So commercial fishing is incredibly important to my family. It is who we are. It's who we have all grown up to be. The current Magnuson-Stevens Act, I think, has done an incredible job in making the United States and its partners in state fisheries managers the best regulated fishery in the world, period. No two ways about it. My concern, though, is the amendment in the nature of the substitute would absolutely annihilate our recreational and commercial fisheries. It would have a devastating impact on coastal communities. And a major issue there is how it now addresses bycatch. The current language says that we limit bycatch to the extent practicable, which means there are different types of gear out there, and sometimes that gear during certain times of the season does have incidental bycatch, incidental, not purposeful. And I would argue to the lady from Alaska that I think that the current language here is going to have some significant impacts. As you know, red king crab season is closed. So where are crab fishermen going now? They got to go catch barradie and Ōlelo. And guess what? In that crab pot, guess what they also catch? Black cod. And when they catch a black cod, guess what happens? They could be criminally prosecuted for catching a black cod in their current Ōlelo and barradie pots. I don't think that's what Alaskan fishermen want. I think taking away the language to say bycatch to the extent practicable in saying that now bycatch is this open subjective standard that fisheries managers can put into place is going to be incredibly harmful to our recreational fishermen and to our commercial fishermen. I want to talk too about what we do with essential fish habitat. Listen, we all want to preserve essential fish habitat, but the ANS edition of the term adverse effects without any further guidance opens up a Pandora's box. I mean, now you go into a subjective area about what are adverse effects. And listen, I put a bill forward to enhance fisheries habitats to make sure that local governments, state governments, and federal governments are working together to enhance those fish habitats. But now if you create unattainable standards by putting these subjective elements in there, I would argue that you actually take away from where the strength is with what happens currently with our Magnuson-Stevens Act provisions. Along with that, there's another things too that weaken our councils. Our councils are those conduits to the community. to our commercial and recreational fishermen. Those councils are meant to work to make sure that there's local input on how these decisions are made. This bill takes away the authority and flexibility of those councils. It makes it much more a top-down effort than it does put it in the hands of the councils. And listen, we can all go through what councils do and what don't do. And I'm sure my colleague from Alabama will talk about red snapper, as well as my colleague from Louisiana about what happens with those councils. But I want to make sure that indeed we have that local input. Councils are incredibly important to make sure we're doing the things necessary moving forward. Under this legislation, too, the councils, if they don't complete their fishery management plans within 180 days, the secretary would then be given the ability to develop the plans. I mean, what happens if they're waiting for more data? What happens if there's something there they need to complete a plan? 180 days absolute says, guess what? By the way, we're going to take away your ability, regardless of the circumstance. And I would argue that our system has worked because it's been a cooperative agreement between communities, between states and commonwealths, and between the federal government. That's how it has worked the best. There's been some pretty vigorous debates about how those things should happen. But when you take away that mechanism and create a top-down approach, I would argue you hurt communities. You take away the voice of the commercial fishermen, the recreational fishermen, and you put the decision-making in the hands of a few. That is never, I think, in the best interest of our nation. Magnuson-Stevens has been, to this point, a bipartisan effort, and I think it should be, because these resources belong to all of us. They don't just belong to one particular element or one state. These fish have tails, and they swim, and they move from state to state, and everybody has an obligation, local, state, and federal, to manage these resources in a responsible way, but in a responsible way that includes what the impacts will be on neighboring states and neighboring communities. That, to me, is incredibly important. That's what has been the strength of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. What we see today in this amendment in the nature of a substitute vanishes all of that, takes it absolutely away, creates a top-down approach. And listen, we all have in our hearts the desire and the need to protect a resource. And listen, there's lots of pressure on those resources today. We have more and more people that are trying to enjoy that resource on the recreational side, more people that want to enjoy the seafood from our oceans and our rivers and our tributaries. Those things are incredibly important. So I hope that we look at what this bill does to Magnuson-Stevens today and keep in mind the impact on our communities, on our states and commonwealths, and on our nation's fisheries resources. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Chair reminds everybody that we've got a long day, so if we can stick to our 5-minute allotment, we can move this along. Thank you very much. Before we consider amendments, does any other member wish to be recognized on the bill? Mr. Graves, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first I want to welcome the gentlelady from Alaska. Welcome to the committee. I do want to, I guess, challenge one thing that the chairman noted about this being a great committee. It's not. It's not a great committee because everything is done in this committee is done in a partisan manner. I think that we have many opportunities to work together in a bipartisan manner and get stuff done. And when I say get stuff done, look, you can pass things through majority all day long through the House. You can do it all day long. It's not going to see the light of day in the Senate, just like this bill. And I really wish that this committee worked more so in a bipartisan manner to get things done. And the ranking member Westerman has this photograph up there, and look at that photograph. You've got Republicans and Democrats up there. This was Magnuson being signed into law, and the only way that this bill would ever get signed into law is if you have a similar group of supporters, like you do right there. And this bill at this point doesn't do that. I want to thank my friend from California for working with us on the fisheries disaster language. I think that there's some significant improvements there. Our fishermen have been pounded by disasters and only repounded by the fact that government at both the federal and the state level seem entirely incapable of getting the money out to disaster victims. And you put that on top of all the foreign fishery pressures that I heard Ranking Member Westerman note, that you've got other countries dumping fish, subsidizing fish, undermining our domestic commercial industries. This has a profound impact. I also want to thank the gentleman from California for working. I think some of the data modernization provisions in here are helpful for both recreational and commercial. And as we've talked a good bit in the past, we share the objective of ensuring we have sustainable stocks. The Gulf of Mexico, where I have the real pleasure of representing together with my friend Mr. Carl from Alabama, it's different than just about anywhere else, in that the recreational fishing pressures are unlike anywhere. And the folks in that picture right there will tell you that when Magnuson was first created, it wasn't designed to really contemplate recreational, because there wasn't enough pressure on the recreational side to really be a blip on the radar. That's changed significantly. We have a substantial amount of recreational fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. This committee, we did finally work together and get the Descend Act, to get the Modern Fish Act, and worked with some people in this room to get state management of the red snapper fishery, which I think has been a successful model for all 5 Gulf states, using better data, better science, and ultimately better sustainable management practices. One of my biggest concerns about this bill is I think that this bill, it's done this. So it has a provision in here on essential, or a whole section on essential fish habitat. It creates a NEPA-like, it took you a minute, I saw that. All right. It creates a NEPA-like process for essential fish habitat. And look, I'll be the first one. There are some challenges with essential fish habitat on both sides that I think need to be fixed, but the solution in this bill, you're creating a NEPA for essential fish habitat now. Look, you can go talk to anybody in this administration. They're going to tell you one of the biggest challenges they have in delivering, whether it's renewable energy projects, it's transmission, it's infrastructure, it's the regulatory process. And we're making it worse in this bill. And I think that there are some challenges that can be and should be addressed, but we're creating an entirely new regulatory structure that is going to further challenge our ability to do things in coastal communities, including projects that are designed to have environmental benefits. And I'm really concerned about that. I think that some of the climate provisions in here, some of them, we need to be thinking long-term and thinking about resiliency and changes, but I think some of them go too far. I think taking away some of the power from the councils and the states are problematic, and that we need to have these solutions. As I noted with the red snapper solution for the Gulf of Mexico, we need to have the solutions closer to home. And I think there are a number of provisions in here that are ultimately going to be fodder for litigation. And I have strong concerns about our ability to actually govern and manage fisheries, as opposed to being stuck in court for long periods of time. So I want to thank my friend from California for working with us on some of the provisions. I want to thank you and your team for working with us on some of the amendments today. But I do think we have a ways to go in terms of getting this bill to a posture where it could actually be at a signing ceremony, as we see here. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. I was fully expecting you to break out in song when you held up that. I'm sure you know the words or have invented new lyrics. Is there any further debate before we begin the amendment process? Without objection, the ANS offered by the chair is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Thank you. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Huffman Amendment number 1. I will pause so that members joining remotely can unmute themselves. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
Members will please mute again. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Representative Peltola, you have an amendment designated number 1. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Case. This amendment specifies that there would be added 2 additional seats to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. Those 2 seats would be designated as tribal seats for members of any of the Alaska Native tribes. The Secretary of Commerce shall consult with Alaska tribal governments, and the 2 Alaska tribal seats shall be filled by people who possess knowledge of subsistence uses, customs, and traditions.
Thank you. I recognize myself. I rise in strong support of the gentlewoman's amendment. First, personally, I want to welcome you to this committee and recognize the special relationship that Hawaii and Alaska have had for since we both sought and obtained statehood all of those years ago in 1959. It's been a long and productive partnership, particularly on issues that affect Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians, but that has certainly broadened into other areas to include the application of indigenous people's knowledge to the management of our fisheries. We share a lot along those lines. Looking forward to a very productive relationship with you. As for the amendment itself, I wholeheartedly agree that we should set a fair and clear process for selecting Alaska Native seats on the North Pacific Council. This amendment does just that. The fact of the matter is, when we have witnessed Magnuson-Stevens in action over a half century, Alaska just has many, many very specific, very different areas of application, not just because of the sheer size and importance of that fishery to not only Alaska, but to our country, but particularly in the area of the involvement of the indigenous peoples in the practicing of their own practices, as well as their instinctive knowledge for how to manage that fishery. It's one of the most actively managed and involved indigenous peoples, fisheries in our country. And I think that this additional representation, which Mr. Young supported, is justified. Thank you very much. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, question for you. I hear the gentlelady talking about representation from what she views as underrepresented communities in Alaska. Certainly sensitive to that. I think that the Native communities in Alaska certainly should have a voice at the table. But we got a couple of questions. Number one, a lot of us have Native communities in the areas that we represent. Do the Native Hawaiians have representation on the council?
Not per se, but as indigenous peoples. And if the gentleman would allow me to expand, please, to your next question, I do believe that Alaska Natives deserve this consideration, and I would not apply the same consideration to Native Hawaiians, because I think they are adequately represented for the fishery size, importance, and for the other factors. So I do believe this is a special case.
All right. Well, I think it's worth. Thank the gentleman. I think it's worth pointing out that not all Native communities have specific seats on the councils, and again, Native Hawaiians do not. I'm looking at this from Mr. Benson's perspective. Right now you have the council that's got six from Alaska. You have 3 from Washington and 1 from Oregon. I understand that we may need to think about allocation among states, and perhaps it is fair to have Alaska to have more, but you've got 6 already, so does it make sense to simply take some of the ones that exist now, some of the 6, and program those specifically for Native Alaskan members? Because otherwise you are further diluting the representation of the 1 member from Oregon. It does have an impact, and if we're going to take that same approach, Louisiana, we're such better fishermen than Alabama, then we should have all the Gulf Council members, right, Mr. Carl? I really wonder if there's not a better solution here, and instead taking 1 or 2 of the 6 that you already have and saying we're going to reserve these for Native Alaskans. Because keep in mind that the Secretary of Commerce appoints your council members, based on recommendations from your governor. And so I wonder if there's a better way to address this, either with the governor or by tagging some of the existing members, those slots specifically to Native Alaskans.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yield to Mr. Westerman.
Thank the gentleman. And you bring up a great point that I observed while in August. I got a chance to go out on the west coast of Washington State, and I visited with the Nisqually tribe, who had a very similar story to what the gentlewoman from Alaska was telling about, reduced amounts of salmon in the Nisqually River. And they have great data on that. They actually put tracking devices in these salmon fry. And they took me down a boat to the Delta area, and there were sea lions just lined up for the smorgasbord as the salmon came down the river. And Mr. Bentz may be able to answer this, but I don't think there's any designation for Washington or Oregon natives on the council. Yeah, so if we're going to go down this road, maybe we need to look at the other states as well. Thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back.
Thank you. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Petola Amendment number 1. I will pause so that members joining us remotely can unmute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
Members will please mute again. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I would just make a big picture observation on this amendment and some other amendments that follow the same theme. And the observation is this. When we passed Magnuson-Stevens half a century ago, we had no idea how integrated our oceans were. We thought that somehow we could pass a law where you could go out and, regulate the catch in tuna, for example, and not really worry about obviously we had anticipated some of it with Magnuson-Stevens, but science has proved that the oceans are far more integrated, far more dependent on various parts of the oceans. And so the idea that we would kind of go backwards and try to treat Magnuson-Stevens as sort of a stovepiped exercise, either by the species that are affected, or for that matter, by the distance from shore, near shore, EEZ, open ocean, none of that is plausible anymore. And so the fact of the matter is that we have to manage on a holistic basis, and we have to worry about bycatch, and we have to worry about impacts on forage fish, as will be discussed in an upcoming amendment. And so it's entirely appropriate that we try to go out there and strengthen a focus, in this case, on bycatch, and enshrine into law what the best fisheries management councils are doing already, which is to contemplate bycatch consequences and limitations and results. And so, that's the big picture that we are discussing from a policy perspective. And I think that this amendment takes us backwards in that respect. Yes.
And just by way of some clarification, because again, I think we want to try to weed out the hyperbole in this conversation. The law says that the objective under Magnuson-Stevens is to minimize bycatch. By definition, that is an acknowledgement that there will be bycatch. I'm not trying to eliminate bycatch. No one is proposing in this bill to eliminate it. It's the words that follow that statutory language. Minimize bycatch to the extent current law says practicable. We would change it to possible, but you're still within the context of acknowledging bycatch will always exist. We're just trying to manage it more seriously. I think that's the reasonable interpretation of what we're trying to do, and I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I yield back. Any further discussion? Yes, Mr. Carl.
One quick thing, a little bit of common sense, let's try to apply it here. We're trying to take fishermen that are not ignorant people by no means, but they make a living out of catching fish, not keeping documentation. They're trying to feed their families. They're trying to provide the market with what the market needs. And yet we just keep restricting them and getting tighter and tighter and tighter, all for the cause of good management of fish. The people that will benefit the most from good management of fish are these fishermen, are these people that are catching these fish. So us not including them, I understand that my colleague had this tour that he keeps referring to. I would be interested later to have a conversation with him, find out where in the Gulf Coast he had it. I understand that my colleagues, it happened 4 or 5 years ago, they weren't aware of it, something anyway. With that said, did he come to the Mobile? Did he come to Balabatry, talk to our fishing industry? That would be concern of mine, because I don't think he would have the same attitude if he talked to the people that I have to talk to every day when we start talking about these issues. With that said, I would like to give the remainder of my time to Mr. Whitman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Carl. I do want to be clear. We want to do everything we can to reduce as much bycatch as possible. No two ways about it. But I would argue with my colleague from California that his concern about the subjectivity with the words "to the extent practicable" is the same subjectivity that we're worried about could be used to shut down a fishery with the wording "possible." Because there's a whole lot of possibilities out there, but are they practicable? And it's great to research new technologies. I'm all for that. I want to do bycatch reduction in every way, shape, or form. But what's not kept in mind in this is you can do all the experimentation, but just like we saw with TEDs on the shrimp fishery, there's never a consideration about what it would cost for a fisherman to fully replace all of their gear. Great example would be in the Alaskan king crab fishery. Those pots themselves run about $2,000 a piece. If you have to rebuild those pots, and now you have 200, 300 pots in your inventory, and now because of a new requirement of possible, there's a lot of possibilities there. Now you have to replace all your gear. There's no provision given in here for the gear. We experimented and figured out a better way to do it, but there's no provision to say for a fisherman that may not have the financial wherewithal to say, now I've got to replace my gear in a realm where they're struggling just to keep up. I think those things too aren't considered with this. With that, Mr. Chairman, are you back?
Thank you. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Whitman Amendment Number 1. I will pause so that members joining remotely can unmute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
No. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman, we request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. This vote will be postponed pursuant to the chair's prior announcement. Representative Whitman, you have an amendment designated number 2. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this is a very simple amendment. It strikes certain language from Section 505B regarding the minimum required precautionary standard for the overfished fisheries and preventing overfishing portion of the bill. And my amendment simply eliminates the language in the amendment in nature of substitute to 16 U.S.C. 1853A10 that would require council, scientific, and statistical committees to set a wide range of boundaries on many day-to-day conservation and management recommendations that Fishery Management Council technical staff make to their fishery management councils. We all know that those councils have technical advisory staff that take data, look at it, analyze it, try to make some sense out of it. And these scientific and statistical committee members serve as part-time volunteers for their respective councils. And they're selected because they have experience. They have the scientific knowledge, the background, the educational background, the experience in the field. And these committees function largely as peer review bodies so that we can have some outside view on what's happening with the data. And they don't have the time or the resources to come together to establish science-based limits on the day-to-day empirical decisions that go into managing a fishery. They just don't have the time or the extent of opportunity to be able to do what this requires them to do. And that's why councils have their own technical and scientific staff. These dedicated council staff do an incredible job assisting councils to conserve and manage our nation's fisheries. They are indeed experts. They're immersed on a daily basis in the details of the individual fisheries that they manage. Scientific and statistical committees should peer review council and National Marine Fisheries Service staff work, not make decisions for them. I think that this places in the wrong realm the elements of what needs to happen with these scientific and statistical committees. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Huffman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I must oppose this amendment. The reason these committees exist is to give councils the best available science to inform their fisheries management decisions. That's what it's all about. And this amendment would remove what I think is a common sense requirement that fishery management plan criteria should at least reflect the minimum standard that is inclusive of that best available science about the fishery. If the best scientists in that region are saying there's a red flag about overfishing, and a council chooses to ignore that and say, go ahead and overfish, that's a problem. That's what Magnuson was all about, to prevent that kind of thing from happening, to have sound fishery management built on the best available science. Unfortunately, I would oppose this amendment and urge members to vote no.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Whitman Amendment number 2. I will pause so that members joining remotely can unmute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No.
No.
Members will please mute again. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Representative Whitman, you have an amendment designated number 3. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment adds the following language to the end of Section 502 dealing with essential fish habitat consultation. The language is, the requirements under this section shall not apply to the Department of Defense. In having had extensive conversations with the Department of the Navy, they're very concerned about increased requirements for adverse effects to habitat areas of particular concern that may not be practical to implement and could result in what I believe are substantial mission impacts and financial cost. Listen, there are some areas of habitat areas that have some very specific concerns in certain locations, but they can also include broad types of habitat covers such as corals both near and deep offshore, and it doesn't necessarily limit it to just water column over those corals. It can be in surrounding areas, which create a whole significant area of concern for the United States Navy, especially as it relates not to their big craft, but their smaller craft. Remember, they have a lot of smaller craft that special operators operate, 11-meter ribs and others that would now be called into question as to how they operate, both in training and in operations. Some of the habitat areas of particular concern are located in fairly deep water and far from shore, and this also increases the complexity and financial expense associated with trying to monitor potential effects. In addition, there is a significant amount of ambiguity and inconsistency with the way fisheries management councils designate essential fish habitat and habitat areas of particular concern with respect to artificial structures. And those are new structures that are created every day by putting a ship on the bottom or old concrete from a bridge on the bottom. And those are in open water areas, which not only themselves create an issue, and the Navy has to deal with those from a navigation standpoint, but now also impact them from an operational standpoint. And if corals and artificial structures are interpreted by the habitat areas of particular concern, this would vastly increase the cost and impact to the Navy's mission, given our extensive waterfront holdings and regular need to conduct maintenance on these structures, and which would now be considered habitat areas of particular concern. The Department of Navy should be concerned about reduced pathways to construct consultation and substantial changes in the duration of the consultation processes. There are a lot of things that they ought to be able to have the time to look at what the impact is going to be and comment on those impacts. And the consultation pathways now are significantly reduced in order for them to do that. My amendment, I believe, is a common sense amendment that ensures the Department of Defense can carry out their service to our nation and make sure they can continue on the path of their number one job, and that is to protect the nation and be able to successfully accomplish their mission. This, I believe, sidetracks them in many ways that take away from the resources that they use to do the things necessary to protect the nation. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I guess listening to this debate, I would paraphrase what one of my colleagues said of Congressman Young and say that environmental protection and our national defense are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they coexist just fine in many areas. And the fact of the matter is that if we are going to save our oceans, if we are going to have a sustainable fishery, if we are going to have a marine world that still works in another 50 years, nobody can utilize it with impunity. Nobody has carte blanche for our oceans, and that includes the Department of Defense. Now, I credit, and we're talking obviously primarily about the Navy, but not exclusively. I credit the Navy with really doing a sea change, so to speak, over the last 20 years or so, in terms of its focus on conservation of our ocean resources. The Navy is far more understanding, far more receptive, far more participatory than they ever were in terms of ocean-related concerns. I just attended, for example, the meeting luckily in my backyard, of the U.S. Coral Reef Conservation Task Force on my home island of Hawaii about 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Navy was a full participant in the U.S. Coral Reef Conservation Task Force. They wanted to conserve our corals. They understood the need not only to do so, but the need that they be a contributing member of that. And I could give you other examples. Now, I'm not going to say that everything's okay with the Navy, because we have whole areas of operation of the Navy in our oceans that are still highly problematic from an environmental perspective. And I don't believe that, again, those operations need to be mutually exclusive with our national defense. So I respectfully don't buy the argument that this amendment, this choice is necessary for national defense. As the chair said, this is a matter of consultation. And I think I take him at his word that if that consultation is overly burdensome on the Navy and on our national defense, then in fact, we should take a very close look at it and figure out how we can accommodate that particular concern. But a simple request for consultation in this particular area of fish habitat maintenance, essential fish habitat, I think can be highly beneficial, not only to ocean conservation, but to the national defense and to the Navy's credibility in its use of our oceans as we go forward. So I must respectfully disagree with the gentleman on his amendment from that perspective, but certainly endorse the further kind of, evolution of this particular proposal. I yield back. Is there any further discussion? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Whitman Amendment number 3. I will pause so that members joining remotely can unmute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. A recorded vote has been requested. This vote will be postponed pursuant to the chair's prior announcement.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Case.